And thanks so much for inviting me to be with you on this glorious morning. I live in Washington, D.C., and I want to tell you, not only is the weather not like this, the atmosphere is not like this. I'm grateful to the Grand Valley University Foundation for asking me to be part of this centennial celebration for Colonel Ralph Hauenstein, a remarkable man in so many ways. How many other veterans here today, not just World War II veterans? Would you raise your hand if you're a veteran? That's quite a few. I know that for a couple of years before the war, Ralph was a newspaper editor in Grand Rapids, and he went on to other things, great things. And I, too, spent a lot of time in a newspaper newsroom, a quarter of a century in my case, mostly at the Washington Post, before going on to other things, writing with the longer lens that narrative history affords. I now consider myself a recovering journalist, and perhaps Ralph will appreciate the story that was once told to me about the world's first brain transplant. The night before the surgery, the doctor went into the patient's room and said, "Congratulations, sir, you're about to have the world's first brain transplant, and you have a choice as to the kind of brain you can receive. You can have the brain of an Army officer. That will cost you $100 an ounce. You can have the brain of a professor of history, tenured. That will cost you $200 an ounce. Or you can have the brain of a journalist, but that will cost you $1,000 an ounce." And the patient said, $1,000 an ounce? That's outrageous. Why is it so expensive? The doctor said, "Do you have any idea how many journalists it takes to get an ounce of brain?" As recovering journalist, Ralph, that's an easier story to tell, isn't it? Well, Jack London said that rather than sit back and wait for inspiration, a writer ought to light out after it with a club. And more than a dozen years ago, I set out with my club and my small fraction of an ounce of brain, and I started a project which I called the Liberation Trilogy. And it was intended to tell the tale of the American Army's role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. The first volume, An Army at Dawn, was published in 2002, and it recounts how American and British forces invaded Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, fighting first the French, and then in a 7-month campaign full of sorrow and error and valor, fighting the Germans and the Italians in Tunisia to complete the occupation of North Africa in May 1943. The second volume, The Day of Battle, published in 2007, picks up where Volume 1 ends. It recounts the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and it carries us into the campaign for Italy. Salerno, Anzio, Cassino, the Rapido River, through the fall of Rome on June 4th, 1944, 2 days before the invasion of Normandy, with many of the same characters from Volume 1, Eisenhower, Patton, Montgomery, Churchill, Omar Bradley, people you've heard of, and many fabulous new ones, including figures who've long been consigned to obscurity. Volume 3 picks up the story on the eve of Normandy and takes us through the end of the war in May 1945. I started writing Volume 3 in November 2010, and I'm pleased to tell you I finished the epilogue about 10 days ago. It's taken me 13 years to write 3 volumes, totaling some 750,000 words. This morning I'll try to boil down to about 30 minutes some of the things I've learned about the main character in that trilogy. It's not Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, but in fact it's the U.S. Army itself. And we'll leave plenty of time for questions and your comments. Well, rather than talk about the Army as an institution, a big green machine, let's focus first on the people who composed that Army and her sister services. Of the 16,112,566 American veterans of all services from the Second World War, just about 2 million remain alive. My father and Ralph among them. About 300,000 of them will die this year, and they're leaving us at the rate of 797 a day, or 33 an hour, or about 1 every 2 minutes. Sometime around Christmas in the year 2014, the number will dip below 1 million. And a decade later, in 2024, fewer than 100,000 veterans from World War II will remain. In 2036, it's the last year for which demographic figures have been calculated by the government, the American cohort that fought and won the most destructive war in human history will be reduced to 370 survivors. That's less than half the size of an infantry battalion. And although these statistics are as stark as mortality itself, we know that this will be a protracted farewell. The last Revolutionary War vet lingered until after the Civil War, dying in 1869 at the age of 109, while some War of 1812 veterans lived to see the 20th century, and Civil War veterans lived into the 1950s. The last Spanish-American War survivor died in 1992 at the age of 106. Of the 4.7 million Americans who served in uniform in World War I, the last survivor, Frank W. Buckles, died last year at the age of 110. The last known World War I veteran in the world, a woman's Royal Air Force vet named Florence Green, died 3 weeks ago in Britain. They're all gone from World War I. So what is it we think we know about the thing that was at the very core of the American effort in World War II, the U.S. Army? This is obviously a very big subject because it was a very big war with a lot going on. It was a war that lasted 2,174 days, a war that claimed on average 27,600 lives every day worldwide, or 1,150 an hour, or 19 a minute, or one death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. And I know that makes Ralph nervous when I do that. Ralph and I have a history about that statistic. Well, in an effort to get your arms around this stupendous catastrophe, the greatest calamity in human history, let's examine 10 points every American ought to know about the U.S. Army in the Second World War. We can all probably agree that we'd like our fellow Americans to know more than 10 things, but we'll give it a shot and we will leave time to talk about it. Point number 1, the U.S. Army was a puny weakling when the war began. In 1939, and of course the European War began in earnest on September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 17th among armies of the world in size and combat power, right behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. The Army in 1939 comprised 190,000 soldiers. It would grow to 8.3 million in 1945. That's a 44-fold increase. When mobilization began in 1940, the Army had only 14,000 professional officers. The average age of majors, a middling rank between captain and lieutenant colonel, was nearly 48. In the National Guard, nearly 1/4 of first lieutenants was over 40. And the senior ranks were dominated by political hacks of certifiable military incompetence. Some American coastal defense guns had not been fired in 20 years, and the Army lacked enough anti-aircraft guns to protect even a single American city. The senior British military officer in Washington told London that American forces are, as he put it, more unready for war than it is possible to imagine. In May 1940, the month that the German Blitzkrieg swept through the Low Countries and overran France, the U.S. Army owned a total of 464 tanks, mostly puny light tanks with the combat power of a coffee can. There was also a mental unreadiness in many quarters. In 1941, the Army's cavalry chief assured Congress that 4 well-spaced horsemen could charge half a mile across an open field to destroy an enemy machine gun nest without sustaining a scratch. This ignored not only the evidence of the Second World War, which was already 2 years underway, but also the evidence of the First World War. Point number 2, and we'll linger on this one for a minute because it so contrasts with our current day. The war encumbered all of America. Obviously, a great deal happened to get from an army of 190,000 to an army of almost 8.5 million. A total of 16 million Americans served in uniform in World War II. Virtually every family had someone in harm's way. Virtually every American had an emotional investment in our army. Virtually everyone had skin in the game. That World War II army of 8 million existed in a country of 130 million. By comparison, today we have an active army of about 570,000 and a bit more than 1 million additional with the National Guard and Reserve, this in a country of 311 million. Almost no one has skin in the game. About the time of Pearl Harbor, Army planners estimated that the U.S. Army would require 215 divisions by 1944. A division typically had about 15,000 soldiers. We never even got close to 215. Instead, the Army mobilized only 90 divisions by the end of the war, of which 89 joined the fight. That compares to about 300 divisions for Germany, 400 for the Soviet Union, and about 100 for Japan. There were several reasons for this. First, the manpower demands of the air forces, and particularly of the supply services, competed with the manpower demands of the Army. Service forces, quartermaster, transportation corps, and the like, were more than 1/3 of the strength of the Army by September 1942. Second, there was a gradual recognition that the Soviet Union was fighting most of the German army, which meant the United States would not have to face as many Germans as originally feared. There was also a recognition that the United States could provide industrial muscle, unlike any nation on earth, to build tanks, airplanes, and trucks, to make things like penicillin and synthetic rubber, not only for us, but also for our allies. That meant keeping a fair amount of manpower in factories and other industrial jobs, while, of course, getting women into the workforce as never before. Because we had relatively few divisions, 89, that meant virtually all of them had to be committed to combat. A bit more than 2/3 of the U.S. Army fought in Europe and the Mediterranean, with the remainder in the Pacific, as well as all 6 U.S. Marine Corps divisions in the Pacific. It also meant you couldn't easily pull these divisions out of the war to let them rest or rebuild. They had to be kept up to strength while in the fight. This is very difficult. So desperate was the Army for manpower as the war intensified that physical standards for draftees continually evolved. The average GI was 26, born in the year that the war to end all wars had ended, in 1918. But the force grew younger as the war went on. After D-Day in Normandy, nearly half of all American troops arriving to fight in Europe in 1944 would be teenagers. You needed men, you sent boys. 1 in 4 GIs held a high school diploma, though more than 1 in 3 had only a grade school education. 13% had attended college for at least a semester. War Department pamphlet 2113 told them they were the world's best paid soldiers. A private earned $50 a month, a staff sergeant $96. Any valiant trooper awarded the Medal of Honor got an extra $2 a month in his paycheck. How did the standards evolve? At the beginning of the war, an inductee had to have 6 molars and 6 incisors, 12 of his original 32 teeth. And dental defects led to about 1 in 5 of all rejections for physical deficiency. In other words, if you didn't have decent teeth, you couldn't be drafted at the beginning of the war. But by 1943, you could have 0 teeth and be drafted. This is because the Army and Navy drafted 1/3 of all the practicing dentists in America and put them to work making prosthodontics and otherwise attending to the teeth of young American men. During the course of the war, those military dentists filled 68 million teeth. They extracted 15 million more, and they made 2.5 million sets of dentures, all to bring soldiers to the point of being able to masticate the Army ration. I know it sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. Had this remediation effort not occurred, had the original standards obtained, the Army would have lost 1 million men for service. It's the equivalent to about 65 divisions. Likewise, vision standards changed to the point that a draftee could have 2,400 in both eyes if it was correctable to at least 20/40 in one eye. There were jokes that the Army no longer examined eyes, it just counted them. And in fact, you could be drafted if you had only one eye. You could be drafted if you were completely deaf in one ear, if you had lost both external ears, if you were missing either the thumb or 3 fingers from one hand, or missing a great toe. By the end of 1943, the Army was drafting 12,000 venereal disease patients each month. About 200,000 were inducted altogether, of whom 85% had syphilis. All that penicillin proved very useful. The standards for mental and personality disorders went through more radical revision than any of the physical induction standards, so that in late 1942, the Army began drafting obsessive compulsives, as well as those who stuttered or stammered. Still, draft station examiners were given a list of 25, quote, personality deviations, which could lead to disqualification if the examiners thought they were severe enough. These included abnormal anxiety, silly, inappropriate laughter, instability, sulkiness, sluggishness, discontent, lonesomeness, depression, and resentfulness to discipline. I must say that had those standards been strictly observed, every teenager in the United States would have been disqualified. Those of you who are parents know what I'm talking about. Point number 3, the United States Army did not win World War II by itself. We can be proud of our role, proud of our Army. We must not be delusional, chauvinistic, or so besotted with American exceptionalism that we falsify history. I mentioned that the war began in September 1939, 27 months before American entry into the war. The war was fought on 6 continents. It was a global conflagration unlike any seen before or since. The British, needless to say, have done a great deal in those 27 months to keep alive the hopes of the Western democracies. I've also mentioned the Russians, who lost as many as 26 million people in the war. 14% of the Soviet population died. And they did most of the bleeding for the Allied cause. More Soviet troops were killed at the Battle of Stalingrad than all the American troops killed in all of World War II. By the end of the war, there were about 60 nations on the Allied side, aligned in what President Roosevelt had long called the United Nations, lowercase. In Italy alone, we had Brazilians, Poles, Nepalese, New Zealanders, French, Italians, and a number of other nationalities fighting alongside us. Point number 4. The U.S. Army's role in the liberation of Europe did not start at Normandy. That army, those soldiers and commanders who land in France on June 6, 1944, didn't leap fully armed from the ether. They had a pedigree, individually and collectively, and it's difficult to understand what happened in those final 11 months of the war, of the European war, following the invasion at Normandy, without understanding what preceded it. The path to Normandy actually began more than 2 years before D-Day, and it involves other earlier D-Days in North Africa, in Sicily, mainland Italy. Those antecedent invasions were vital in shaping the forces that fought in Northwest Europe. Point number 5. The U.S. Army, for some considerable time after we entered the war, was not very good. Part of the mythology of World War II was that all the brothers were valiant and all the sisters were virtuous. War is the most human of enterprises. It reveals every human foible and frailty, as well as human virtues, cowardice and tomfoolery, as well as courage and sacrifice. With apologies to my good friend Tom Brokaw and to Ralph, the greatest generation label is nonsense. Greater than the founding fathers? Greater than the Civil War generation? And which generation from World War II are we talking about? The generation of senior Army leaders like George Marshall, born in 1880, George Patton, born in 1885, Dwight Eisenhower, born in 1890, or the generation of trigger pullers, mostly born in the 19-teens, in the 1920s. Ralph was born in 1912. His boss, General Eisenhower, was 22 years older. That's a full generation. What we see in the first couple of years of the American involvement in World War II is an army burdened with equipment that in some cases is clearly inferior to the enemy's, tanks being a good example. We see an army burdened with a number of commanders who are not up to the task. Of the first 5 corps commanders in action against the Germans, a corps consists of 2 or more divisions. Of the first 5 corps commanders, 3 are sacked for incompetence. Our first adversary in the liberation of Europe is not the Germans, as I mentioned, but the French, and we're not brilliant against them. But the point is this: those first couple years of war require a sifting out. It's an evaluation at all levels within the Army, from platoon leading lieutenants to the highest commanders. A sifting out of the competent from the incompetent, of the physically fit from the unfit, of the lucky from the unlucky. Napoleon's favorite trait in a general, luck. It's incredibly important in war. It's sometimes been argued that in an even fight, when you match one American battalion or a regiment against a German battalion or a regiment, the Germans tended to be superior, the better fighters. An even fight. Who said anything about an even fight? Global war is a clash of systems. Which system can generate the combat power needed to prevail, whether it's in the form of the 13,000 Allied warplanes that were available on D-Day, the 10-to-1 American advantage in artillery ammunition often enjoyed against the Germans, the ability to design, build, and detonate an atomic bomb. Which system can produce the men capable of organizing the shipping, the rail and truck transportation, the stupendous logistical demands of global war? Point number 6. The U.S. Army in World War II comprised much more than just riflemen. It also included, for example, the Army Air Forces, which in turn embodied the single greatest military disparity between us and our enemies, the ability to flatten 50 German cities, to firebomb Tokyo, to reduce Hiroshima and Nagasaki to ashes. Those fleets of airplanes, 1,000 bombers at a time attacking enemy targets, are perhaps the most vivid emblem of the so-called arsenal of democracy. That arsenal of democracy that outfitted not only our military, but to a large extent our military allies. The United States, and those of you from Michigan will appreciate this, built 3.5 million private cars in 1941. 3.5 million. For the rest of the war, we built 139. Instead, in 1943 alone, we built 86,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, 648,000 trucks. We made in that one year 61 million pairs of wool socks. Every day, another 71 million rounds of small arms ammunition spilled out of American munition plants. Point number 7. The Army remained from the beginning of the war to the end under civilian control. When the President in July 1942 made the decision to invade North Africa, contrary to the advice of virtually all of the uniformed military advisors, in Washington, he signed the order Franklin D. Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief, lest there be any doubt whence his authority derived. Harry Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bomb, not the military. Military strategy, not to mention decision-making, tends to be made during World War II by the civilian leadership, frequently counter to the military's druthers. Kent Roberts Greenfield, who was a very fine Army historian, wrote a book called American Strategy in World War II, and he lists almost 24 decisions made by Roosevelt against the advice or over the protests of his military advisors from 1938 to 1944. Additionally, there are more than a dozen strategic decisions for which the initiative apparently came from the president. A good example of this is the initiative which came from the White House to declare that unconditional surrender would be a central Allied war aim. Point number 8. The U.S. Army in World War II is among the greatest agents of social change in the country during the 20th century, perhaps the greatest agent. This is ironic given the inherent conservatism of the institution. Our national evolution on core issues of racial and gender equality are very much shaped by World War II. The U.S. Army was segregated in World War II, true enough, and exclusionary. A long study by the U.S. Army War College on the role of black Americans in combat, written in the 1920s and sent to the Army Chief of Staff, concluded that, quote, the Negro is by nature subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He cannot control himself in the face of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative and resourcefulness of the white man. The Negro is a rank coward in the dark. As a fighter, he has been inferior to the white man even when led by white officers. The Negro officer was a failure as a combat officer in World War I. When the war began in September 1939, fewer than 4,000 blacks served in the Army. By early 1944, that number exceeded 750,000. And the disparity between the avowed principles for which the nation fought and the stark, hypocritical reality of American life in the 1940s gave impetus and legitimacy to the civil rights movement. Many African Americans endorsed what they called the Double V campaign, a righteous struggle for victory over both enemies abroad and racism at home. Severe restrictions on combat roles for black troops gradually eased. A group of fighter pilots known as the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated the inanity of those restrictions, including assertions that black pilots lacked the reflexes to be good fighter pilots. Anybody seen the NBA lately? The hundreds of thousands of blacks who served in the Army during the war, including thousands who volunteered as combat infantrymen after the Battle of the Bulge, helped demonstrate the moral bankruptcy and intellectual depravity of attitudes like those evinced in that Army War College study. It's hard to imagine Barack Obama, that skinny kid with a funny name from Chicago, elected as President of the United States in 2008 without the accelerated social change of World War II. It's also true that the Army in World War II was an overwhelmingly male institution and exclusively male in higher leadership roles. There were about 1,300 generals in the Army as of July 1944, and not one of them was a woman. The first female Army officer was not promoted to general until 1970. But the extraordinary demand for military manpower meant that women were drawn into the national workplace in exceptional numbers. It's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Point number 9. The history of the U.S. Army in World War II is among the greatest stories of the 20th century. And it ought to be taught and learned as a story with character, plot, conflict, denouement. When we contemplate what is lost to us culturally as that World War II generation forever slips into the shadows, it's perhaps the ability to bear witness to tell the story firsthand, to attest with authenticity and authority why they fought, suffered, and died. 14 million American veterans have left us, and for all the stories told and retold, countless others will go untold. No one bears witness to the most elemental emotions of war, including fear and despair, like those who were there. A soldier in the 36th Infantry Division, which had been the Texas National Guard, once confessed, "I was scared for 23 months. I saw the best troops in the world cut down and replaced 3 or 4 times." No one can convey the vivid immediacy of combat better than the eyewitness, like an air crewman describing anti-aircraft fire over Romania. He wrote, "It came like a mighty shout, a malediction hurling up at us through 4 miles of twisting wind. They were everywhere. The dark flowers of flak were everywhere." So as the primary storytellers die off, it's important for their survivors, for us, to sustain the story, to keep it a vivid narrative that lives and breathes rather than something desiccated, rapidly receding into the past with ever-diminishing power to stir us. Point number 10, our final and most important point. I won't belabor it. We talked about the Army in World War II as both an organism and a machine, an institution that grew stupendously, that demonstrated flexibility and adaptability. We ought never forget that at the core of the story is heartbreak. The United States military sustained almost 300,000 battle deaths during the war and about 100,000 others from accident, disease, suicide. Many of those deaths were horrible, premature, unspeakably sad. With your indulgence, I'll read you a fragment from the Epilogue from Volume 3 of my trilogy that I've just finished. I went to Iraq in 2003 as a reporter with the 101st Airborne Division, and I was embedded for the whole war up through the capture of Baghdad. And I was at the elbow every day, all day, with a guy I've known for a long time, someone you've heard of, David Petraeus. And at one point, just before the war began, Petraeus came up to me, and he was no more than 6 inches from my nose, and he said, "Tell me how this ends. Tell me how this ends." What a good question. Well, we know what happened to our dead from World War II. About 78,000 were never recovered, mostly lost at sea. Of those who were recovered, 61% were repatriated, brought home for burial. Families were given the option in 1947, a one-time choice, bring them home or leave them abroad. And the rest remain overseas, most buried in American battle monument cemeteries, which are gorgeous and very moving. But what about the things they carried? What about their stuff? What happened to that? Here's what happened to that. The Army Effects Bureau filled a large quartermaster warehouse at 601 Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, just below a majestic bend in the Missouri River. From a modest enterprise that had begun with a half-dozen employees in February 1942, the Effects Bureau had expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars into a receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. Here, with assembly line efficiency, the containers traveled by conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor. As inspectors pawed through the crates to extract classified documents, pornography, ammunition, and perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend that would further grieve a grieving widow. The prevailing rule on Hardesty Avenue was said to be, remove anything you would not want returned to your family if you were the soldier. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to polish corrosion and blood from helmets and web gear. Laundresses took great pains to scrub bloodstains out of field jackets and uniform blouses. A detailed inventory was pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in a storage bin, And all the while, banks of typists on the 11th floor hammered out correspondence to the next of kin, up to 70,000 letters a month, asking where the soldier's last possession should be sent. Bureau inspectors over the years had found tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, a tobacco sack full of diamonds, walrus husks, a shrunken head, a Japanese life raft. Among thousands of diaries also received in Kansas City was a small notebook that had belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, a 29-year-old Army officer from Aurora, Illinois, shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese in New Guinea. Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and in the several days that it took for him to die, he had scribbled a final letter in the notebook. "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister," he wrote, "I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but rather why he is making me suffer." That's how it ends. That's the answer to General Petraeus' question. That's how it always ends. Thanks so much for allowing me to be with you this morning to celebrate Colonel Hauenstein. I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much. Okay, if you'll raise your hand, we have microphones, I believe, and if you'll wait till a microphone arrives, they want to get your clarion voice on digital recording. Yes, sir, over here.
My question has to do with, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
My question has to do with today's announcement or recent announcement about the lower funding for the defense budget, and what your opinion is on that affecting our military going forward.
Well, you always want more money than you've got for whatever you're doing, whether you're running a global military enterprise or running a small company in Michigan. I believe that Secretary Panetta, who's obviously been listening very carefully to the uniformed military and many other people, has come up with a credible, sensible plan in the face of necessity. This isn't an Obama initiative. This is required under the terms of the budget agreement that was effected by Congress. And because they could not come to a sensible agreement on how to reduce the budget overall, these automatic reductions kick in and they fall pretty heavily on defense. It's my belief that with the war in Iraq now ended, with the war in Afghanistan I think clearly ending, that the reduction of Army manpower from 575,000 or so to 490 eventually, and this is over time, doesn't put us at risk. They're going to lean more heavily on special operations, which they've been doing for a long time. War is changing in a lot of ways, as you can see by the extensive drone warfare that we've been conducting now for years. And you don't necessarily determine how effective or efficient or combat ready your military is on the basis of raw numbers, or the basis of how many ships you've got, or the basis of how many air wings you've got. Now, having said that, we've been down this road before. And the lack of preparation before we went into World War II, for example, or any of our wars for that matter, up through World War II, and Korea included, leads to one thing. When you're not ready, boys die who wouldn't have died otherwise. And now boys and girls, because you don't go to war without the women. They're absolutely critical to the force structure. And they do virtually everything the men can, and often they do it better. So, you know, I think my feeling is that the need of all of us to keep a close eye on it, to be attentive to it, to know that it's our problem, it's our army, our military. We do have a dog in the fight. We do have skin in the game. And we've got to, as good citizens, be aware of that. And we have to monitor it closely. And if we decide collectively that it's not appropriate, that somehow we're cutting too close to the bone, then we need to make our voices known, and something needs to be done. We have to give, something has to give. It's a very, very tough problem. It's one of the toughest problems of all the tough problems in Washington now. Sir, in the back there. Hang on a second. Wait till she gets the microphone to you.
History of, you talked a little bit about special forces. History of special forces and the role they play today?
History of special forces and the role they play today?
History of special forces in World War II.
Yeah.
I assume that's where it began.
Yeah.
And what role do you see them playing throughout the day?
They like to think actually it began before the Revolution. You know, there were Rangers, and Rangers were a kind of special forces in the 18th century, sort of elite forces. And the Ranger concept, which is the basis for contemporary special forces, particularly in the Army, was revived in World War II. At the beginning of the war, there was a young officer who was in his early 30s. He was no older than Ralph was then, named William O. Darby, and he was given command of a Ranger battalion. They did quite well in Africa, and so the Ranger battalion became a Ranger regiment, basically. There were several battalions put together and sent into Italy, and then that grew further, and the Rangers heroically scaled the cliffs at Pont du Hoc at Normandy, and so the recognition of the need for that kind of competence, where you have soldiers who are very, very fit, very motivated, highly disciplined, and capable of leading other men in the dark of night, which is the essence of what good infantrymen do, was recognized as being valuable. And the SEAL teams that we have today, the guys that got Osama bin Laden, all of that is going on today in a very intense way, largely out of sight. It's not very transparent, derives from that. There were other kinds of special forces. There were beach landing forces. The Brits had pioneered some of that. And those are really direct predecessors of the SEALs, where you go in and you do skulky reconnaissance, usually at night on a beach. You might bring back samples of sand to determine whether the beach can bear heavy traffic when you're moving invasion forces against it. All of that stuff began in World War II. So what you see today is a special operations capability, and it's across all the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, that is really impressive. If you're around those guys, as I am sometimes, you think, oh, where did these guys come from? There's a recognition, among other things, that wasn't well recognized in World War II on the importance of physical fitness. We think, okay, well, that makes sense for soldiers, right? I mean, Ralph would know it, but it wasn't well appreciated. You see over and over in a soldier's letters back to his home, ordinary infantry soldier, dear Mom, we ran on a company run today. They made us run a whole mile. Fortunately, let us have a cigarette break halfway through. That happened a lot, and the problem with that is, and Eisenhower smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. 4 packs of cigarettes a day, the Supreme Commander. He never did not have a lit cigarette in his hand. The problem with that, you can probably get away with it if you're 54 years old and the Supreme Commander. If you're an infantryman fighting in Europe in the Bulge in December 1944, you have got to be in the best possible shape you can be, because that will determine frequently whether you live or die. And that has now been, you've seen soldiers around, men and women, they're just in tremendous physical shape by and Mental shape is something else that wasn't properly appreciated. We now know a lot about what we call PTSD. We knew a lot about it from World War I. It was called shell shock. And that expression went out of currency after World War I. And we forgot what we knew from World War I. We'd learned a lot about it and how to treat it in World War I. And among other things that were allowed to languish between the wars was psychiatric treatment of psychiatric disorders. Neuropsychiatric is what they would call it in World War II. We had to learn it again. And now we know a lot about it, and we've not forgotten about it. And we know much better how to treat what we today call PTSD and to recognize it. There's a very serious effort to destigmatize it. There was, for a long time, a belief in the services that if you showed signs of mental fragility, well, we just don't think we can use you in this man's army anymore. Now that is gone. You have people like Carter Ham, who commanded the 1st Infantry Division, then was the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe until recently, and now he's our senior Army commander in Africa, very publicly talking about the symptoms of PTSD in himself that he recognized and the treatment that he received. That's really important. It's a sign of great leadership from a great leader. And that tells others, okay, I can get help if I need it. So those kinds of things have evolved considerably, as well as just the structural operation of special forces, special operations. President, hang on a second.
Thinking about this, today it's purple. It's the inter-service cooperation. How was the inter-service cooperation during World War II?
Terrible. It was really dreadful. Particularly the higher you went, the worse it was. There were these fiefdoms, Army, Navy. Now, the Air Force is part of the Army at the time, but the Air Force spends most of World War II, in addition to doing all the great things that they did, trying to unhook itself from the Army. The efforts by Hap Arnold, who was the commander of the Army Air Forces, and all of his lieutenants to decouple from the Army, as the Royal Air Force had from the British Army back in the 1917, something like that, were prodigious. They spent a lot of their time talking about it, thinking about it, trying to do it. And it didn't happen until after the war, but it gives you a sense of what the relationship was like. Now, today, there's a lot more exchange of experiences and so on. So it's, for example, not unusual for a Navy officer to go to the Army War College. Rather than go to Rhode Island for the Naval War College, he'll go to Pennsylvania and Carlisle for the Army War College, and vice versa. And Air Force does the same. Instead of going to Alabama, they'll go to Rhode Island or they'll go to Pennsylvania. And that happens at all levels. There's a lot of exchange back and forth. You know, the phrase is one team, one fight. This is really preached. You have now woven into the force, for example, when I was with the 101st Airborne, every place we went, at every level down through battalion, and it might have been even down in some cases to company, there would be an ALO, an Air Liaison Officer, usually a pilot, who had communications, and he could talk not only to the central coordinators of whatever airstrike was coming in that you'd called in, but usually talk directly to the pilots overhead. They had nothing like that. There were sort of modest advances to try to be able to do that sort of thing beginning in 1944, but it was pretty rudimentary. And as a consequence, you had frictions. You didn't understand that air tribe or that those guys on ships, that tribe. You see Patton, for example, he's with an admiral, he's a rear admiral initially in 1942, named H. Kent Hewitt, one of the great sea dogs in our history. And Hewitt is commander of the fleet that takes Patton's force from Norfolk, across the Atlantic, to land in Morocco on November 8th, 1942. And Patton kept a very detailed diary and was a prolific writer. And you can see he's very disparaging and dismissive of Hewitt. He's with Hewitt again for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. And by now they're on first name basis. It's Kent and George. But still there's friction, and privately Patton's very dismissive of Hewitt because he's a Navy guy. So that's toxic, particularly if you have limited resources. If your army's gone down to 490,000, you have got to be able to leverage everything you got. Army, Navy, Air Force, political advisors, special ops, all of it has to be really woven together as tightly as possible. And there's nobody at the senior level in the military today who doesn't get that. Now, boys will be boys, and there's at the chief's level, I think marginally less so now, but just during the Persian Gulf War, for example, there was still a lot of friction between those guys. A lot of it's about money. Whenever the money grows tighter, the frictions get, you know how it is. You're competing with Ann Arbor and Lansing and all those other schools in Michigan. You know what I'm talking about. And it's human nature, and particularly when there's money at stake. Good question. Sir?
What do you see as a solution to, lack of a better terminology, the Iranian problem?
Oh yeah, I've got that one in my back pocket. I don't know. I think it is a problem. I think Iran cannot be allowed to have atomic weapons. I think it's just too destabilizing in a part of the world that's already so horribly destabilized. The military options are very poor. They're perfectly aware of what penetrating bombs can and cannot do. We used penetrators, GBU-28, I think it was called. They were cobbled together in '91, the last week of the Gulf War, in order to get at some of Saddam's deeply buried command posts. It's this big old thing, and it is built in such a way and has a fuse that is engineered so that it will penetrate many floors, really, underground before detonating. But if you dig it a little deeper, you put it into the side of a mountain, and I don't know what the Israeli stocks are of those things, but they would need them from us if they did it in a big way, and they tried to hit all of those Iranian facilities. And so they would need anything from us. They've got limited stocks. And so we're immediately dragged into it if the Israelis get into it. That's why I believe the Obama administration and Secretary Clinton and others are working so hard. I know the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is talking to the Israelis a lot. Don't. Let's see how sanctions are working. Sanctions seem to be having some effect. They're hurting in Iran. And I think you turn the screws tighter, and today there's some evidence that maybe the Chinese are even more fully on board, and the Russians will be the Russians. But Dave Petraeus told me, this is a long time ago now, so I can tell you, before the war started, and we were having dinner in Kuwait, in Doha, the mess hall, before the invasion of Iraq began, and he said to me, "I am not sure that sanctions have fully run their course." Boy, was he right about that. And I certainly felt that way myself, and I feel that way now about Iran. I feel that once you've pulled the sword and you've stuck it into the other guy's ribs, it's always hard to tell what's going to happen. It never happens the way you think it's going to happen. Something different. It always veers some way. That is the nature of war. So my feeling is that turning those screws on them as tight as you can, doing whatever you can short of launching a war against them. We don't need another war in that part of the world. Good God. But back to my original answer, I haven't got a foggy idea. Sir, right here. Hang on a second.
No, I don't need that. I don't need that.
Okay.
In Europe, at the end of World War II, they left an awful lot of American soldiers. They had encampments and that nature. And now with the world economy as it is, if we withdraw those to supplement this reduction in bodies, so to speak, what impact will that have on the total economy of the world?
You mean if we draw some of our forces down that are overseas now?
To reach that lower level.
Oh, I think it's minimal. Yeah, because, I mean, look in Europe, for example. Now, I was born in Munich in 1952. My father had been in World War II, came home, went to college, went back into the Army, made a career out of it. And we lived in Salzburg. Nice, yeah, really nice. And to be a victor in post-war Europe was pretty good. My father is a lieutenant. I don't know, what did a lieutenant make, Ralph, in 1952? Probably $200 a month, something like that. But we had a maid and a cook, and it was good. And the American presence was enormous. And even I lived in Berlin from 93 to 96, and it was still pretty good. The Americans left Berlin in 1994 as part of the agreement for the Soviets to pull their forces out of East Germany, including Berlin. Remarkable sight, seeing Boris Yeltsin literally leading them out of Berlin. And we pulled all our forces out, and we reduced it substantially, and now we're going to reduce, this is however many years later, to 2 brigades in all of Germany. You think the German economy is hurting? I don't think so. You know, it's minimal. And our forces elsewhere are, tiny. There's a brigade in Italy. We're arguing with the Japanese over basing. We'll put some more forces in Australia. They don't need forces for their economy down there. So I think that is the least of the factors in thinking about that. Stability is a much bigger thing. So, I mean, that's what you want to be looking at when you're talking about the health of the global economy. Yes, ma'am. Wait. I know you have a big voice, but you have to wait.
I was just thinking that you have studied war for years, right?
Yeah.
And you know a lot about war. Would you be willing to share your personal perspectives of how it's impacted your life and your thinking and what we could learn from you?
Yes, I'm sorry, you're going to have to buy the book. Well, yeah, I have. I've spent my adult life, I grew up in the Army, but I've spent my professional life studying it and being around it, being in it. I've been to Somalia 3 times, and Bosnia, and Iraq a lot, and Afghanistan. The more I think about it, the more heartbroken I am. This scene I read to you of those dead boys' effects coming home, that just tears me up. And that's 60-some years ago. Because it's so wasteful. You think of all those lives that never had a chance to play out, never really had a chance to begin. And not just the American lives, not just the 19-year-old who's killed in the Bulge, but all of the Germans lost 7 million. I told you the Soviet And you know, my mother was an Army wife. I remember well the tensions in the family. My father in Vietnam for a year, and the pressures. And he came home fine, but it's so enervating. And so none of that's very profound, I think, but it resonates very deeply with me. And it's one of the reasons why I continue to do it. I think I'm done with World War II now. 13 years is enough, but I will find another war to write about, because I think it's just important for us culturally and intellectually to, first of all, to remember, but also to understand the emotional resonance of it. And the emotional resonances carry through for unseen generations. Think of all those, if you've ever gone to the cemetery at Normandy, or the one at Anzio, or the one in Carthage in North Africa, or any of those American Battle Monument cemeteries, and you see those dead boys, and you think of all the brilliant things they didn't do, and all the children they didn't have, and the grandchildren they don't have now. And what a calamity, what a loss for all of us. Not just for them, for their families, but for all of us. So that's what I think about it. I feel it very, very deeply. Sir.
This will be the last question then. Thank you.
In your 13 years of researching this and writing this trilogy, what was the most unexpected or surprising thing, sort of the, wow, I didn't know that?
Well, gosh, fortunately, almost every day I find surprises. And even though I do know a lot now, I still find surprises. Some of the surprises are cultural, I suppose. The depth of Anglophobia in the U.S. Army, for example, continues to surprise me. Patton, Bradley, almost all of them were deeply distrustful of the British. Eisenhower was the exception that proved the rule. Eisenhower was not Anglophobic, and that's one of the reasons why he's such a successful commander of a command that has many nationalities. So that continues to surprise me, and there's all kinds of reasons for it, having to do with World War I, having to do with the general isolation of American culture before World War II, the snootiness of the Brits, that's not to be discounted. I find things, I'm an archive rat. If you're trying to tell a much-told story, you really need to get into the archives and find stuff that people have not found. And the Army records alone from World War II, U.S. Army, one service, one country, weigh 17,000 tons. It's a lot of paper. And no one's ever looked at more than a fraction of it. So I spend a lot of time at the National Archives and Library of Congress and many other archives. And you find things, so for example, just to give you an example, if you're thinking about invading France and you're thinking, God, there's a lot of Germans over there, and we know they're going to be tough because we've done invasions already, and they were tough. They almost threw us back into the sea at Salerno. They almost threw us back into the sea at Anzio. And we know that coming by sea is difficult because they've got all these bunkers and revetments and guns and so on. And we know that coming by air is tough because we've done paratrooper operations, and they can be anywhere from okay to catastrophic. What other options are there? Well, how about digging a tunnel under the English Channel? And so I found the plan. It was a plan to dig what we would today call the Chunnel. And there was a staff group was put together to study it. Ralph, did you ever hear about the Chunnel? Well, they studied it hard, and they put some iron majors on it, and they came back and said, sir, we can do this. It'll take months, and we'd have to remove 50,000 cubic meters of dirt and put it somewhere and so on. But we can do this. The one question they could never get past is that last 10 feet. You know, because you have the whole German 7th Army and 15th Army. So in the great tradition of staff studies, it went on a shelf and nothing came of it. But I find things like that all the time. I found the target lists for gas weapons. We had tens of thousands of tons of nerve gas and mustard gas, nasty stuff that had been used extensively in World War I, and even nastier stuff that had been developed since World War I. And we were ready with stockpiled in England. We eventually put stockpiles on the continent. And we were ready to use it if the Germans used it. We had a principle of no first use, but if they used it, we were going to use it big time. And I found the target lists. So if the Germans had used mustard gas or some other nerve agents in Normandy, here were the lists of what we were going to take out. It was basically every telephone switchboard in Normandy. We were going to hit all of the communications nodes and put persistent agents on so that they couldn't be used again, and lots of other things, lists of enemy units and locations and so on. So, you know, I find stuff like that pretty frequently, and it's rewarding, actually. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.